the notion, the existence, the word, the feeling. How can we even begin to separate the idea of existence or non-existence of God outside of the cultural context with which we have been basically indoctrinated for God knows how long time. The current sort of notion of non-existence of God is primarily based on the necessity, I believe evolutionary necessity, to cleanse all that deposit that with which the religious institutions manage to pollute the direct and immediate and intimate relationship between the soul and the being from the capital B. Okay, one may argue and say that the concept of God is already non-existent in certain religious traditions like Buddhism, but that is not entirely true. The idea of shunyata or shunya, the void, not necessarily argues or denies the concept and the existence of divinity or the Godhead. But I will leave that for a moment because it's a scholarly conversation and I would like to answer the question in as sort of simple way as possible. Of course God exists. He exists as you and me simultaneously, and all the myriad of creation, all the creatures that have ever lived and will ever live simultaneously and apart from each other in time. So that, the existence of God cannot be proved, nor non-existence of God can be actualized. It can only be experienced, but in order to experience the existence of God, this temporal reality of me and you would have to cease. So, to prove God's existence, we would have to annihilate our own existence, because two cannot coexist simultaneously in its full measure. Just to give you an example, it's maybe a very primitive example, but it will give you an idea. A course in photography. When you try to adjust the focus on, let's say, something which is on the front, whatever object, flower, portrait, a tree, a chair, anything. What is on the background, which is far away, will become faded. And soon as you will start adjusting your lens onto the foreground, let's say on the mountain region that is far, far away, everything on a front plane will have to become out of focus. That is the way the lens working. It is also the way our human eye working. You can just prove that exercise by trying. Go outside and try to hold a flower in your hand and try to look simultaneously at the flower and at the far, far, far reaching horizon. You won't be able to do that. You would have to adjust your gaze either at the flower or at the horizon. It's very similar in the situation with individual existence, the perspective of individual soul in relation to the Absolute, in relation to God. Yet it doesn't mean that the experience of God is not possible. In fact, the history full of examples of beings, and not just the history I'm talking about the history as the whole, unfolding time-space phenomena. I'm talking about beings who are living now in the present, along with those who have lived in the past. The experience of God is within the capacity of nervous system of a human being, because human being is a byproduct of the whole evolutionary process which unfolds in consciousness, which is God, which means the human being is not different from God, which means human being is a projection which has the capacity to self-actualize its own source of origin. To give you an example, great Sufi poet, mystic Jalaluddin Rumi exclaimed, "In non-existence of my existence, I realized your existence." It speaks for itself. The existence of God can only be proven when this existence vanishes. It's like traveling to the sun. You can travel to the moon, you perhaps can travel to Mars, you can travel to other planets, which are solid and allows you to, land your craft on. But can you travel to the sun? Well, perhaps part of the way, but the closer you will get to the sun, the more likelihood is that the matter itself, whatever it's made of, is going to disintegrate in a sheer impact with that heavenly body. There will be nothing left. So traveling to the sun is becoming the sun. It's inevitable. It's an analogy, but that analogy explains the whole sort of I don't even have words for it, because words basically cannot fully express that state. But then I have to say that it doesn't mean that your temporal reality, your corporal reality has been destroyed. What has been destroyed is the barrier that was there prior to know God directly. The beauty of knowing God is that the individual consciousness, or you and me, is not being destroyed. It doesn't matter how that sits with your understanding of the religious codes, of the religious scriptures, because in order to interpret religious scriptures you need to have someone who has the level of consciousness of those to whom the revelation basically came to be spoken of as any particular scripture. So I would say that the concept of God is not a redundant concept. It's the most highly cherished concept and will ever remain the most highly cherished concept. Perhaps we will find a new terminology, perhaps someone will be more happy to call it, whatever is more comfortable with his or her intellectual, psychological, emotional setup. If Shiva, Allah, Christ, what have you, Buddha, still remains valid in terms of your terminology, then fine. If those historical concepts, those culturally inherited figures, culturally inherited words, culturally inherited concepts are still vibrating on your heart level, then there is no need for any change, because the relationship between the individual consciousness and the absolute, the relationship between the devotee and his or her God, is primarily the relationship of the self to the self from the capital S. And that relationship takes place only on the level of the heart. It doesn't really matter what concepts you hold in your head, what explanations you have. Why do you need any explanations? Love for your parents or love for your children, sometimes very difficult to explain. And that is just an expression of the universal love of God, which runs through the individualized channels of our existence. As long as you hold the concept of God in your heart, it doesn't matter who and what says about it. The most important thing is what makes you feel inside. Because the relationship between yourself and your God can only be solved on that level and not on any other levels. It is the existential relationship, and you are left with that relationship as the most beautiful relationship you will ever have. So, it doesn't really matter what the prevalent notion is and who is, vibrating the air, who is making, waves. Just listen to your heartbeat. There you will find God, and there God will embrace you as you